Welcome back to the fourth part of this four-part series on introduction to governance for private companies, SMEs, and entrepreneurial businesses that are wanting to take their business to the next level. Firstly, we spoke about the concept of corporate governance. In the second session, we spoke about strategy and understanding risk. The third portion, we spoke about directors and what your fiduciary duties and liabilities are, and the fact that you're there to look after the best interests of the entity. The fourth part really comes down to governance tools and what you should be looking at and what you shouldn't. It's all basically encased in King 4. There are different sections. But before we get there, I just want to put one concept across, which is critical to understand, difficult to implement, particularly when you're moving from an entrepreneurial business going forward, or you have a 100% shareholder. But there are three levels. You have your shareholders, you have your directors, or your board, and you have your executive. What happens is the shareholders, let's call this power. The shareholders give power to the directors to run the business via the MOI, the Memorandum of Incorporation. Within there will be limitations of what this board can do while running the company, how it should be constituted, how many members, etc. You need to, if you're sitting on this board, have read your Memorandum of Incorporation. The risk you run is we moved from a memorandum and articles and shareholders agreement and combined them all when the New Companies Act came out into an MOI. I don't think too many people have read it. Believe me, you need to read it so that you know you're operating within the levels of authority given to you by the shareholders. Once you've got that, shareholders, limited liability. If the company goes under, shareholders can lose their investment in the company. They cannot be held liable for anything more. Directors, unlimited liability. So a shareholder cannot tell you what to do. The shareholders' power is they vote you onto the board. It's a 50% plus one. Once you're elected, you now have to draw a line there and understand you operate in the best interests of the entity, not in the best interests of the shareholders. If everything is perfect and everything running well, those two things will be the same. But the problem arises when difficulties start arising. Then you have to take decisions in the interest of the sustainability of the entity. So if a shareholder wants a R1 dividend and the company can't afford it, you don't pay it. You rather put yourself at risk. And I can give you a number of case studies when we exploded into the full process in terms of what happens in that situation. The next phase, directors need to give authority to the executive. And that's done via levels of authority. So the board says to the executive, the CEO, you can buy anything up to R1 million without telling us. You can tell us afterwards. So if you want to buy a piece of equipment, you can go and do it. Your authority is R1 million because we trust you. You decide on what that level is. Post the event at the next meeting, he or she will tell you, I spent the money on this and that's why I did it. If you don't like it, you have the discussion, a robust discussion, and you decide on what should be done next time. Anything, for example, if it is R1 million, anything over that has to come to the board to get authority before you purchase. Those levels of authority are critical because it defines the board is accountable, you're giving responsibility to the executive. Remember the difference between the two? The board is accountable. But if I say to the executive, you can spend R1 million, and he stays within that limit, it's fine, because that exposure won't put the company under. That's how you set levels of authority. If the executive go and spend 10 million without telling you, and it puts the company into trouble, it's not a liability of the board because they've exceeded their limit. The board is not liable for a failed control. They're liable for no control. So you give the executive authority. Please make sure you spend time on those levels. There are lots of examples that you can download from the internet what needs to be covered. The difficulty that we have in business today, particularly in private business, is very often the shareholder is a director, is the CEO. Please, I can't give you the answer. But what I can say to you is please separate the discussions. If you meet for a meeting, is it an executive meeting, a board meeting, or a shareholders meeting? Because what you discuss and the liability of the decisions that you take at each of those meetings are significantly different. Executives can only operate within the levels of authority given to them. When the CEO, who's generally a director, sits on the board, he or she's got to take his executive hat off and put on his director's hat, because he now needs to take decisions with unlimited liability in the best interest of the company and all the fiduciary duties that we spoke about under 3. If you're a shareholder, decision you take here, you've got permission to take via your memorandum of incorporation. So understand that difference. They can't tell you what to do. Please try and say, even if you stop a meeting and start another, just to get into the sense of, are we talking shareholders, are we talking directors, or are we talking executives? From there, we really talk about a board, because the board implements and is responsible and accountable for the controls that you put in. We spoke in the very first session about effective control. The board's responsibility, you sign off on it every year. Whether you know you do or don't, you do in your financial statements. So you have to make sure they're in place. We have a board. Do we need subcommittees? Well, you only need subcommittees depending on your size. A subcommittee is only there because the board is not capable of handling the workload of what it needs to do. So don't have subcommittees unless you need them. 2 of very general subcommittees, an audit committee and the social and ethics committee, are the only 2 statutory committees. So if you have them, you have to comply with the Companies Act. And the Companies Act says an audit committee must have 3 non-executive directors as members. If you don't have 3 non-executive directors, you cannot have an audit committee. Social and ethics committee is all relative to your public interest score. I won't go into that now. We expand on that when we do the full program. But if you hit a certain number of points in terms of your public interest score, you're obliged by law to have a social and ethics committee, and you have to, by law, have 1 non-executive director. So you can see when you're choosing your governance tools and processes and what you put in place, you need to understand where you are. You need to understand what committees you're having, what the Companies Act requires, because you're subject to the Constitution. The Companies Act talks to the Constitution. You're subject to your MOI, and the MOI cannot drop the requirements of either the Constitution or the Companies Act. It can lift it. So if the Companies Act says you need 1 director, your MOI can say you need 3. But it can't say, I don't need any directors. It can't drop the requirement. It can lift it. And then once you enter your committees, you've got to have things like terms of reference. Do you understand what's required? All the committees, subcommittees cannot take decisions. They have to make recommendations and put it back to the board for a final decision, because the board is ultimately liable and accountable. So please just make sure. There are a host of pro formas that will show you what sort of systems you can have in place and what tools you can use, but one system does not fit all. Depending on your size, depending on your requirements, depending on your makeup, you will choose what's applicable to you. And that's the beauty of the structure as King 4 has put it up. Because if you look at King 4, they talk about strategy, talks about structure, talks about risk or measurement of compliance. So you must have risk, you must have technology, you must have compliance, you must have remuneration. You're responsible for those things, and there are recommendations and there are principles that you need to rely on. But if you're small enough, a board is sufficient. You don't need subcommittees. Understand what you need, and then delve into what fits you best to perform your duties in terms of, I like to call it effective leadership. There are other elements that will say direct and control the company to meet your fiduciary duties. But for me, look at it as effective leadership. I hope you've enjoyed the 4-part series and understand that we do a full-blown program, but it's geared towards you.